Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So today, I wanted to talk about the technology of war. I wanted to talk about also the media coverage of the ongoing conflict. I've talked about this before, obviously. But if you were to watch, and you do watch, mainstream media here in the United States and other places, you would think that Russia is conducting human wave attacks against World War I era trench lines. Now, have there been human wave attacks? No, there has not been human wave attacks, essentially by either side. There have been infantry attacks, but not these so-called human wave attacks. In fact, the battles for Bakhmut, in particular, where we hear most about, at least from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, talking about waves and waves of Russian soldiers assaulting Ukrainian lines and those Russian soldiers being mowed down en masse. That is not what is happening. It is a very complex war that is taking place, or did take place, in Bakhmut. We saw extensive house-to-house, street-to-street fighting that is done with very well-trained forces. Urban combat is incredibly difficult. It is a three-dimensional war. And that was what was taking place in Bakhmut, not these human wave attacks as the media would like you to believe. Furthermore, another area that is not covered at all. There was some significant events that took place in the month of March that really has not been covered at all by Western media, and that is the satellite launches by the Russian Federation. In March alone, the Russians put up 3 military satellites. On March 13th, an Olymp K satellite was launched. And that was a military package for electronic intelligence. On March 23rd, we had a BARS M number 4, Cosmos 2567 military cartography was launched. And then finally, on March 29th, there was an EO MKA-4 Cosmos, and again, that was a military launch as well. And that was just in March. And then in May, the Russians launched another military satellite. So we have 4 military satellites now in 2 months. The Condor FKA number 1. And we believe that was a remote sensing satellite with some advanced radar sensors that can look down and monitor Ukraine in real time. So again, in the West, Western media, you heard nothing about Russian preparations in terms of its preparation in its ongoing war in space. And having the ability to have intel via the satellite systems is incredibly important. And again, 4 satellites the Russians launched in March and May. But again, if you look at the media resources, the Russians are using World War II era tanks. The Russians are running out of tanks. They're launching human wave attacks. But nothing about these 4 satellite launches. Furthermore, and this is even more important, the Russians have been actively training and preparing its anti-satellite, anti-GPS capability. These are ground-based systems that are designed to use high-powered lasers to disable the U.S. global positioning satellite system. But nothing in the press, nothing in the mainstream media about this. The Russians are preparing for something very big. Bigger than what we're seeing right now on the ground in this war. And you notice the Ukrainians have completely written off any prospect of the so-called counteroffensive that was supposed to take place in May, the spring offensive. Well, now we're talking about the possibility of a summer offensive. I still maintain you have to watch the Russian buildup in the northern quadrant of the war sector, this area here, north of Seversk. A lot of Russian forces building up in that area. Now, what are they preparing to do? Difficult to say. The Russians right now seem to be perfectly in a position of fixing the lines as they are and just hammering away at Ukrainian forces with artillery and airstrikes. The Russians are launching anywhere from 30 on the low end to upwards to 100 air sorties per day against Ukrainian targets. That's aircraft. They're also launching multiple times a month cruise missile and Iskander ballistic missile strikes and drone strikes against Ukrainian targets. The casualty level, the casualties that the Russians are taking have been dramatically reduced, especially over the last 2 weeks. The Russians were taking casualties in Bakhmut, and they also took casualties in that limited operation near Volodar. But outside of that, the Russians are playing defense. They're playing offensive defense. And again, it's really designed to just fix and hold these Ukrainian positions while the Russian artillery apparatus just pounds away at Ukraine. And that's what's happening. Without a doubt, in all probability, even though you can say the Russians are on the offensive, that obviously it was a Russian invasion of Ukraine. But right now, the Russians are probably taking less casualties than the Ukrainians are right now, the way the war is ongoing right now. Because, the Russians are using artillery, they're using air power, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones to hammer away at the Ukrainians. You're not seeing a maneuver war. Yeah, when the Russians were maneuvering, especially early in the conflict, the Russians took losses, and significant losses, as did the Ukrainians as well. Brutal, bloody battles took place. Now, I would say that early in the campaign, the Ukrainians got the best of the Russians in certain areas. And in certain areas, the Russians got the best of the Ukrainians. It's been a horrendous war, as I talked about from the very beginning of this conflict. I had said, even leading up to the conflict, that this was going to be an incredibly bloody, drawn-out conflict. And it is. You have two industrialized nations going at it, especially when one of these nations, Ukraine, is being supported by many other nations. The United States and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in terms of intelligence and weaponry. But again, the Russian military is continuing to expand. It is continuing to grow. It is continuing to deploy. It is continuing to adapt to modern war. And I anticipate, again, within the next few months, we're going to see the possibility of a very large Russian counterattack take place, or a Russian renewed offensive operation take place, quite possibly in the north. It could be someplace else as well. But right now, it appears that the Ukrainians are very hesitant about launching this so-called counteroffensive. And we've heard about it often, and again, it has been delayed and delayed. Because the West is very concerned that if the Ukrainians launch this, that it is what the Russians want. The Russians want the Ukrainians to launch this offensive operation. Again, it's that It's go back to in history. Look at the Battle of Kursk. The Russians want the Ukrainians to launch this offensive. It will be playing into the Russian hands of offense through defense. And I know that doesn't make any sense for some people, but it could cause the Ukrainians quite a bit of problems, depending on where this offensive is launched, how it's launched, and how well the Russians have prepared. And right now, obviously, the Ukrainians are fairly concerned about this operation. That's why they haven't launched it. But at the same time, look at the continued build-up by the Russians. They have strengthened this line that runs from Kherson all the way to the north of Lysychansk. And then again, look at the information in terms of the deployment of Russian satellites, and especially the renewed training by the Russians on shooting down GPS systems. It's very concerning. Russians are preparing for this conflict to expand. I think the Russians believe at some point the West is going to be at war with China over Taiwan. And then we'll have essentially World War III. China, Russia, and other Russian and Chinese client states versus Western nation states. Now, again, who would join that at this point? Difficult to say. But that's where we set for today. We will have more very, very soon. Thank you for joining us. Have a good day.